Welcome to the Progressive Primitivist podcast, where we believe that the only way to go forward in religion is to go back to the Bible. One of the most obvious differences between most churches of Christ and other churches is the fact that most churches of Christ worship God a cappella. I grew up in the Baptist church, and my first time to visit a service of Churches of Christ happened my junior year of high school. And as I walked in that little modest white frame building and looked at the front of the auditorium, I thought it was strange not to see a piano or an organ, as I'd grown up seeing in Baptist churches. Why is it the case that most Churches of Christ choose to worship a cappella? Well, you're watching one of a series of 3 videos in which Brother Everett Ferguson, Professor Emeritus at Abilene Christian University, presents his rationale for choosing to worship a cappella. These lectures are based upon a book that Brother Ferguson wrote on the subject, which many believe to be the finest book on this subject. We hope you enjoy these lessons.
Good morning. We continue today our study of the case for unaccompanied singing in Christian worship. As I indicated yesterday, we will attempt first of all today to explain the methodology which I have followed in the book, Acapella Music in the Public Worship of the Church, and then go from that to an examination of the historical evidence that bears on this question. In the preface to the book, I state that this methodology involves 3 steps: an analysis of the New Testament evidence, a testing of one's interpretation of the New Testament by the testimony of church history, and a consideration whether there are doctrinal or theological reasons which explain or give meaning to the biblical and historical evidence. This is a methodology which I have found helpful in dealing with disputed questions in reference to New Testament studies. The first step we considered in our class yesterday, where we analyzed the New Testament evidence on the subject. This first step involves assembling the New Testament passages and then using logic to organize the data and draw conclusions from it. And yesterday we explained the 2 things that are involved in the so-called philological or grammatical historical exegesis of texts. First of all, studying the etymology and the usage of words. And then secondly, looking at the historical context of the times to see what are the possibilities in a given cultural setting. And as we looked at that, we saw what the probabilities of the meaning of the word psallo are, and we saw what the musical practices of Jews and Greeks were, and saw how this all pointed in the direction of unaccompanied singing in the New Testament church. But not all draw the same conclusions from that evidence. Is it possible to go further? Is it possible to offer some confirmation of the conclusions reached from looking at these word studies and at the historical setting? It is possible for one to take New Testament texts and put them together and make them mean something that they were never intended to mean. For instance, when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, we learn that the disciples and he were gathered together in an upper room. When we read of the only very full description of the Lord's Supper as observed in the early church in Acts chapter 20, we find once more that the disciples had met with Paul in a third-story room, high enough up that it was a little disastrous for a sleeping church member on that occasion. One could take these two texts, really the only ones that speak to the matter, and draw the conclusion that in order to observe the Lord's Supper, we have to meet in an upper story. These basement and ground floor church buildings just won't meet the New Testament pattern of how to observe the Lord's Supper. And you might even add a theological consideration, I suppose, there and say, well, if you get on the top floor of a building, you're a little closer to heaven, and so that's a more appropriate place where you could observe the Lord's Supper. Well, I think we would all smile a little bit at this suggestion, as some of you are in fact doing now, and say, well, surely that's not what the New Testament is teaching on this, that we have drawn some false conclusions from the examples if we tried to insist that the example of the Last Supper and the example at Troas are in some way binding on where we observe the Lord's Supper today. Surely the New Testament isn't intending to teach that. Well, how would you go about refuting this kind of conclusion? I'm sure there are many ways of doing so. But one way of checking one's interpretation of the New Testament, one way of deciding whether he has read something into the text that never was there, is to look at the testimony of early Christian history, to see if Christians in the first centuries understood it the same way, to see what their practice was. We noted one exegetical control yesterday in looking at the background. Is something possible in terms of the setting of the first century? Another exegetical control is to look at the foreground of the New Testament, to look at early Christian history, to look at the documents produced by the Christians who lived nearest to apostolic times. And we can see how they understood apostolic teaching. We can see how they understood the practice and example of the apostles. And that does not settle for us everything about our practice, but it is a very important witness to the New Testament teaching, and is a very great help to us in knowing whether we ourselves have understood the New Testament aright. And so that is the second step in this a methodology that I'm presenting, after first assembling the New Testament evidence. Secondly, checking this data by the evidence of church history. Did the early Christians understand the matter in the same way? Or stated in another way, are you reading something in or reading something out of the text? Have you drawn the right conclusions? Now, surely the early church can be wrong. It is a witness in the case. It is not the judge. But if something is present in the New Testament, there should be some trace of it later. I think it becomes very suspicious if you think you have found something clearly in the New Testament, but you can't find any sign of it in early Christian literature or in early church practice. And that, to my mind, is one of the fatal arguments against drawing the conclusion that you have to take the Lord's Supper in an upper room. That obviously is just an accident of the two occasions that the text happens to refer to the place in the New Testament. And you're seeing something that wasn't there, and one way that you know that it's not there is by looking at early Christian writings and finding that they didn't see it there and certainly felt no obligation in that regard. So if something is present in the New Testament church, there should be some trace of it later. On the other hand, if something is not mentioned in the New Testament, is that by accident or is that by design? Was something really present and just didn't happen to get mentioned in the New Testament? Or is there a deliberate rejection of something? Well, again, the testimony of early Christian writings is an important witness in answering that particular question. Then the third step in this methodology, which corresponds to the third chapter of the book and which will be our subject tomorrow morning. What are the theological or the doctrinal considerations? This, to my mind, is the really crucial question. It is what wraps the matter up. Now, my main claim to competence is in the area of church history and the patristic texts, and so that's where I've spent most of the space in the book. This is where I could make a contribution that perhaps others cannot so well. But as I have said, to my mind, the history is a witness. And the really crucial thing would be the doctrine that is involved. To take another illustration of how this must be added on to assembling New Testament evidence and checking by church history, there were no public address systems in New Testament times or in the early church. But the reason that they were not there was that they simply did not exist. They did not have them available. There is certainly no doctrinal meaning or doctrinal significance in the non-use of such. You might, I suppose, again, make the argument that it's more fitting to speak the word of the Lord with your own voice. And if someone has J.C. Bailey's voice, even in Moody Coliseum, I suppose you don't have to have a public address system. But yet, most of us find that it's helpful to have some way of enhancing our delivery and making it reach more people. And there's no doctrinal significance involved, however, in the use or the non-use of a public address system. There's no doctrine involved one way or another. And certainly the non-use of such in New Testament times is simply because technically, mechanically, such were not available. And no doctrinal reason why they were not used, and so no doctrinal reason why not to use that now. And so on many other things. But on the question at issue now, the matter of the kind of music to be used in the assemblies of the church, is there some doctrinal meaning or reason involved here? Do doctrinal reasons give us a basis for the absence of it? Or if we were talking about some other matter, we would state the question positively, is there some doctrinal meaning or reason for what is mentioned? You know, on our upper room situation, again, the New Testament never makes anything of the location. There's no doctrinal reason attached. You'd have to invent one for the location. Well, we'll be looking at the doctrinal issues tomorrow, and as I've said, I think that's what really wraps the question up. The first time I applied this particular methodology was in reference to the question of the day of Christian assembly. is the Sunday worship, or the Sunday, the day of a special meeting for Christians. And perhaps if I just briefly sketch the application of this methodology to that, you will be able to see and understand a little better what I'm doing on the singing question. The principal New Testament text on the day of assembly is Acts chapter 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, the disciples in Troas met to break bread. There are other passages that can be brought in. In fact, I think you can make probably a great deal more impressive array of New Testament evidence for Sunday as the day of Christian assembly than is often recognized. I think for many of our people, Acts 20, verse 7 seems like the only text, and that everything hinges on how you treat it and how you interpret it. Really, it does not stand alone. It's part of a complex of many passages from which you can make a rather persuasive case, to my mind. Yet I think we all, in fairness, would have to grant that the New Testament is not quite as clear on this subject as it is on some other subjects. You can assemble many passages on baptism for the remission of sins, or many passages on the mode of baptism as being immersion. But you do not have nearly so many direct and explicit statements that would relate to a particular day of Christian worship. And so it's right, I think, to ask the question, have we put these passages together in the right way? Do they really add up to the conclusions that we have drawn from them? So after assembling the New Testament passages, and here, as I indicated, would not only be Acts 20, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, Acts 2, verse 42, and other passages. But have we put them together right? Is this all pointing to the first day of the week as having some special meaning for Christians and being the day of assembly? Well, one way of checking your interpretation, one way of controlling whether you have organized the material right and used your logic right in looking at these passages is to turn outside the New Testament and look at early Christian literature. And there the evidence is overwhelming. Beginning in the earliest Christian documents after the New Testament, running right on through the 2nd century and thereafter, there are numerous passages, and they are unanimous on the subject, that Christians had their public assembly for corporate worship on the first day of the week. The historical evidence is explicit and exceedingly strong. Well, this confirms that we haven't put things together wrong in looking at the first century material. That we haven't read something out of the text that never was there. That really these passages are talking about a common and uniform apostolic practice in the church that continues on, and the historical evidence is a confirmation of that. But then you can go further. You can take the third step and see that it was not just a matter of custom, not just a matter of historical accident with the early church to meet on the first day of the week. Because there are some very important doctrinal associations made with the first day of the week. In the New Testament texts and in the early Christian texts, there is a theme running through here which uniformly connects the first day of the week with the resurrection. In fact, the greatest frequency of the use of the term, or the word for first day of the week in the New Testament, is in the resurrection narratives. And so for the early church, the first day of the week had great meaning and significance because it was the day of Jesus' resurrection. It was the day of Christian deliverance, the day of Christian salvation. And so that day has a meaning and has a significance that no other day could possibly have for Christians. And I found that with students, this kind of doctrinal approach is a great deal more meaningful than simply citing one text that could be understood as merely a historical reference to what happened in one place at one time and has no more meaning than that. But when you do put this in a doctrinal context and a doctrinal framework, you see that it is a very persuasive consideration. Well, in presenting this threefold methodology that we have outlined, assembling the New Testament evidence, checking it by the testimony of church history, and then looking to see if there are some doctrinal reasons which undergird this evidence, we are developing a different kind of approach to disputed questions than the kind of approach that has normally been used. But I found this to be quite helpful for those for whom some of the old arguments are not as persuasive as they may be for us. About all that has been said in recent years on the subject of the kind of music in Christian worship has been said within the framework of command, example, inference, and silence. And I think about all has been said within that framework that can be said. Now, I do not reject that kind of approach. It's eminently logical and reasonable to me to look for commands and to look for approved apostolic examples, and we always are using our reason when we apply the texts and try to arrange them and put them together in a particular way. And in developing a different methodology here, therefore, I'm not rejecting this other way of trying to prove things. But I am saying that looking at the question in this different way may help move the discussion along, because I have the feeling we've reached kind of an impasse in talking with our instrumental brethren within that framework, that the arguments that have been made have said about all that can be said, and if that doesn't persuade them, there's not a whole lot more that we can do within that framework. And so I'm hoping that, well, if we can move off center here and look at it in a fresh framework, that maybe we can make some progress in a different direction and find another area where we can reach some understanding. The command and example, silence approach, as I've indicated, is fine as far as it goes. But I think in actual practice, we've always recognized that there are some limitations to this kind of approach. And that's suddenly become a topic of discussion again in the Brotherhood, and I don't really want to get into that because I don't think that pertains to my subject right now. But I think we need to do something more than this kind of form criticism of the New Testament materials, that this is a command and this is an example, and you decide that by form, and I guess we've been doing form criticism for 150 years in the Brotherhood and didn't really realize it. But we really do something more when we use commands and examples, in that these things become important and significant when they are put in a total doctrinal framework. And it's the total doctrinal context that gives some meaning. As has often been pointed out, you have explicit commands, greet one another with a holy kiss, but we don't feel like we have to keep that command. Well, we look for a total doctrinal complex here, an association. And again, the commands and the examples, and particularly on the matter of the examples, the historical setting is very important for determining whether that is something approved for future practice, or whether it's just an example belonging to a particular cultural context. And so, although we may not have spelled it out, I think there's always been implicit in our approach a recognition that beyond commands and examples and inferences and silence of the Scriptures, that you're putting these in the doctrinal framework of the whole New Testament teaching, And unless these things fit into that total fabric, they really do not apply now. And that as part of normal and sound interpretation of the New Testament, you're interpreting it in the historical setting and context of its time. And really that's what I've tried to spell out now in this approach on instrumental music and in the book on acapella music, is to take this larger setting, to take the New Testament evidence, then put it in a historical setting and see if the way we have read it makes sense and fits, and then to see if there is some doctrinal foundation which makes this more than a cultural accident and makes it something meaningful and significant. And I believe that it does. And so our main concern has been to establish some historical facts in the book. And if the facts are not as I present them, apart from the hypotheses in this book to explain those facts, there really is no argument from silence. You know, the whole objection, I guess, has been primarily that instrumental music is absent in the New Testament, and so what is not authorized is forbidden. It's an argument from silence. But if we cannot establish its absence, there is no argument from silence. And so what I have tried to do in the book is to demonstrate indeed that instrumental music is absent in the New Testament. And a witness to that is the fact that it remains absent in early Christian literature thereafter. And so I'm trying to do the foundation work here, the substructure kind of work, where you are establishing the facts. Somebody else then can take those facts and make the argument from silence, or make the other arguments that have customarily been made within the traditional framework of command and example and inference. And as I've said, I'm not rejecting that, but I think something else has to be done, something larger, and something, to my mind, really more fundamental. And that's what we have undertaken to do now in the book. Now, yesterday we looked at the New Testament evidence and tried to put it in the context of the history of the usage of the word solo, which is the word in dispute, and tried to put that New Testament evidence in the context of particularly Jewish religious music of New Testament times. And now today, in our remaining half of the period, I want to say just a little bit about this historical evidence. And we have assembled a large number of passages in the chapter 2 of the book. I'll not try to cover all of that. I could not really in the time allotted of one question. But let me just briefly refer to some of the points that we try to cover, and I'll read a few quotations to you also so that you can get the nature and the force of the evidence. But really you need to have the book and to read it yourself to get the whole force of it and to get a better understanding of what the early Christian writers were actually talking about. If we have some time, I'll read some quotations that are not in the book. Some of you should have a little bit of reward for coming to the class and doing something beyond and getting something more than you could get just by reading the book. So we have some time. I'll read some others because as I have continued to look around in this literature, I continue to find other passages. In the chapter on the testimony of history, The first main section concerns singing in Christian worship. I've assembled there some of the passages where early Christian writers describe the practice of singing in the early church. And these statements begin with the earliest of the apostolic fathers. The sermon known as 2 Clement in chapter 9 says, "Let us give him praise, not from the mouth only, but also from the heart." And that statement is typical of many of the descriptions and exhortations in reference to early Christian worship. And I have continued some of these statements on up to the 4th century. But we not only have positive declarations about what Christians did when they came together in their corporate assembly, we also have some explicit statements about the non-use of an instrument. Most of these occur later. There was no reason particularly to comment or reflect on the matter in the earlier period, but as Christians studied the Old Testament and found instrumental music so prominent there, this raised questions in the minds of people, various kinds of questions that Christian leaders had to answer. In a document from around 400 known as the Questions and Answers for the Orthodox, this rather curious question was raised. If songs were invented by unbelievers to seduce men, but were allowed to those under the law on account of their childish state, why do those who have received the perfect teaching of grace in their churches still use songs, just like the children under the law? Someone is kind of carrying the argument against instrumental music to all kinds of music. They sang songs under the old law, and songs can be used for immoral purposes as they are among pagans, so why do we sing? If you look in the other Christian literature, you find exactly these are the two main arguments that are used against instrumental music. They were under the law, and since we rejected the law, therefore we don't use instruments. And that instruments promote immoral purposes in paganism, and therefore we don't use them. Well, somebody here has come along and taken those considerations and applied them even to singing. But here is the answer that the Orthodox teacher gives. It is not simple singing that belongs to the childish state, but singing with lifeless instruments, with dancing and with clappers. Hence the use of such instruments and the others that belong to the childish state is excluded from the singing in the churches, and simple singing is left. For it awakens the soul to a fervent desire for that which is described in the Psalms. It quiets the passions that arise from the flesh. It removes the evil thoughts that are implanted in us by invisible foes. It waters the soul to make it fruitful in the good things of God. It makes the soldiers of piety strong to endure hardships. It becomes for the pious a medicine to cure all the pains of life. Paul calls this the sword of the Spirit, with which he arms the soldiers of piety against their unseen foes. For it is the word of God, and when it is pondered and sung and proclaimed, it has the power to drive out demons. An interesting statement of the power of song and of its place of corporate singing in the nurture of the Christian life. But also a very explicit statement that instruments are excluded from the churches and only simple singing observed there. Another statement of about the same period of time from another part of the ancient Christian world. It is time to turn to the New Testament to confirm what is said in the Old, and particularly to point out the office of psalmody is not to be considered abolished merely because many other observances of the old law have fallen into desuetude. Only the corporal institutions have been rejected, like circumcision, the Sabbath, sacrifices, discriminations of foods. so too the trumpets, harps, cymbals, and timbrels. For the sound of these, we now have a better substitute in the music from the mouths of men. The daily ablutions, the new moon observances, the careful inspection of leprosy are completely past and gone, along with whatever else was necessary only for a time, as it were for children. Of course, what was spiritual in the Old Testament, for example, faith, piety, prayer, fasting, patience, chastity, psalm singing, all this has been increased in the New Testament rather than diminished. And there are many statements for the ceremonies of the Old Testament having been abolished for Christians. The principal place that early Christian writers had to make some explanation of church practice on was when they came to the interpretation of the Psalms. Because here instruments are quite prominent, and Christians sang these Psalms in their worship. And so the commentaries on the Psalms, of which there were many written by patristic authors, had to deal with these passages referring to praising God with instruments that you meet in the Psalms. Thus, the third section of this chapter on history deals with the interpretations of the Psalms. Two different approaches were common. One to say that they belong to the Old Testament, and those things have now been abolished for Christians, and we just sing. And so you take the references to instruments in the same way that you take the references to the temple and the feast days and the Sabbath and so forth in the Psalms as something that has been superseded historically. A more common approach, because these people in preaching sermons and writing commentaries wanted to edify the people who read, was to try to get some moral lesson out of these references to the instruments. And so a very common approach was to allegorize the instruments and say that now for Christians we do not praise God with a literal instrument, but that this instrument refers to the human body, that this is the perfect instrument that God has perfected for his praise. And so the strings of the harp are like the nerves of the body. The trumpets are like the tongue, and so forth. The other parts of the body correspond to these various musical instruments, and you praise God now with voice, with mind, and in bodily activity. Some of the extra statements I will read if we have some time will go into this kind of interpretation. In an effort to be fair to the evidence, I have included a section on statements that have been thought to be favorable to the presence of instruments in the writings of the early Christians. And we have tried to offer some explanations of those and put them in their proper setting. I think we'll not take time to try to discuss that at the moment. And then I go into a section where there are condemnations of instrumental music of any kind. There's a rather large number of these. Sometimes these have been misunderstood. They are not about the presence of instruments in worship. And so are not a polemic against instrumental music in worship, nor are they evidence that such was being practiced by some, on the premise that you don't oppose something unless somebody else is doing it. And usually that's a pretty good rule to follow, all right. But these very strong condemnations of any kind of instrumental music are always in the context of social settings, either in reference to pagan worship, in reference to the theater, in reference to immoral entertainment, and so forth. And so many of the church fathers followed some of the Jewish rabbis in taking an extreme position that you ought to abolish instruments even from the home and from any kind of entertainment. This is not a uniform feature of early Christian thought, but it is certainly very prominent. And it has to do with the cultural significance of instruments at that time. That leads me then to a section on the significance of culture. Well, sometimes the argument has been made, well, the strong statements in the church fathers against instrumental music are culturally conditioned and have no theological meaning and relevance. Well, I think the cultural explanation is valid for these statements about banqueting, immoral entertainments, and so forth. It is because of a cultural setting that you get that violent opposition to instruments in some of the church fathers. But it seems to me that take that away, take that cultural setting away, and you still have this large body of other statements that would remain even so. These allegorical interpretations of the Psalms, these declarations that instrumental music, just like animal sacrifice and the Sabbath day and circumcision, was abolished in the Old Testament and has been superseded by a spiritual worship in the church. These statements are not in the context of culture, immoral associations, pagan worship, or any of those things, and they stand, I think, apart from the cultural explanation, which I think is true of these things about the banqueting and so forth. And thus, in our time, when instrumental music no longer has that kind of connotation, we feel quite free to have a big purple band at ACC, and intended to have musicians at the Friends of the Library dinner last evening. They didn't show up, but we feel quite free to use instrumental music in many other ways because it has a completely different cultural setting and significance in our time. Then finally, in this chapter of the book, very briefly, I go on to trace some of the later history of instrumental music, and I was really a little bit surprised myself as I got into this study. We tend to think of ourselves, and surely everybody else thinks of us this way, I guess, in the American Protestant world, as a little bit peculiar for not using instrumental music in worship. To take the whole sweep of Christian history, we're not that unique at all. In fact, up to about the year 1800, unaccompanied singing is clearly the majority tradition. If you take an ecumenicity of history instead of just an ecumenicity of what's going on right now, the ecumenical practice of the church is unaccompanied singing. The instruments were not introduced in the Roman Catholic Church until perhaps as late as the year 1000. The recent thesis at Columbia University by a Catholic historian of music, McKinnon, has put the date later even than the usual dates that you see in some of the older reference works that are usually cited. But you know, after you get 800 or 900, what's another 100 or 200 years, I guess, as far as its significance. And then it's only in the Western or the Latin-speaking church, what we would call the Roman Catholic Church, where this was done. The Greek Orthodox Church never has introduced instrumental music. A few of their congregations in the Western world under Western influence have done so, but very few. And if you go back to Greece and the Eastern countries, they do not use it. And I had the opportunity last year to attend some services of the Greek Orthodox churches, and they have a very beautiful, transporting even music when it's done as it's supposed to be done, as it is in the cathedrals and in the monastic churches, where they have the trained singers to do it, and some of the local parish churches where there's just the priest who recites it. Not that compelling, but they have a very beautiful music for which, as McKinnon points out, instrumental music is just completely inappropriate. It just does not fit that kind of singing. Well, the Eastern Orthodox churches have continued the unaccompanied singing. Many branches of Protestantism practiced unaccompanied singing. The churches derived from the Anabaptist movement of the Reformation, and the Reformed churches deriving from the work of Zwingli and Calvin, too. And it was only in the 19th century, late 18th and 19th century, just shortly before it was introduced in the Restoration movement, that instrumental music began to make inroads in the churches of the Reformed. tradition. Now, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican churches and churches derived or related to them, of course, have used instrumental music, but the non-use of the instrument is by no means as unique as we might think of it as if we looked across the board in the situation today. Well, as some of our instrumental brethren have looked at my book and have corresponded with me about them, it seems to me that they've rather uniformly missed the point or missed the significance of this historical evidence and the historical argument. Because usually those that comment on it bring up all the other things that some of the church fathers were for or against. Some of them who opposed instruments promoted monasticism and a lot of other things that we would think are wrong, and they say, well, you surely don't want to do what all they did and take them as authority. Look at all these other things that represent error that they promoted. And that misses the point of the argument altogether. Maybe I did not drive it home as well as I should have in the book. These men in their writings are witnesses to a fact. They testify to the absence of the instrument in the churches of their time. And it's not that I'm appealing to them as the authority to decide what we do now. I'm appealing to them as a witness to what was the historical situation. On something like monasticism, we know that's not present in the New Testament. We can trace its rise in history, and we can see where it started. That's not the case with the kind of music. The evidence is continuous right on through from New Testament times up to these later authors. And so there's first of all the fact that it's absent. And this in turn is a witness to what is present in the first century, because if something was there in the first century, but everybody says it's not there immediately after the close of the canon, you have to explain what happened to it. If it was practiced and then everybody dropped it, there ought to be some kind of evidence of that. It should have left some kind of notice in the historical record. That would be a change, and a significant one. And if you cannot find any evidence of that change, if you can't find some evidence that it really was there, then you're forced back one more step to the next problem, that if it's absent in the New Testament, are we justified today in making a change from apostolic practice? Now, if you are not a restorationist, I suppose you can justify a change on other grounds. But if, like our instrumental brethren, you profess loyalty to the apostolic church and want to restore the apostolic church, then you need to have a very good reason for doing something now that they did not do then. And I don't see that any of our instrumental brethren have ever faced the force of this historical argument. And to me, it's very persuasive. Now, there may be some reasons why in something we can do something now that was not done then. But I haven't seen those reasons yet. Now, as I've suggested, if something was not available back then and can promote and help us in the work of the church now, that's quite all right. We use a public address system and so forth. Those things weren't available back there. But in the matter of instrumental music, this thing was available. In fact, it was very prevalent in the culture, And not just in pagan worship, but in approved, God-approved worship in the temple among the Jews. And so if something now is not present in the churches organized by apostles, it certainly looks to me like it's deliberate that it's left out. And if it's not deliberate, somebody's going to have to come up with some very good explanations for not only the silence of the New Testament, but this very solid and consistent body of historical evidence that says not only it wasn't there, but that we have good reasons for leaving it out, that it belongs to a childhood state of worship, as in these passages we read, and is not appropriate now for the spiritual worship of Christians. Now, that's what we'll be talking about tomorrow. The doctrinal reasons, as we get into the very nature of worship. I said I'd try to read maybe some additional passages for you, and we have just a few minutes, I suppose. One of the main passages that was commented on in these commentaries on the Psalms that I've referred to is Psalms 32:2. And I'll just take about our last 4 minutes here to read what I have time for. Cyril of Alexandria, the Bishop of Alexandria, beginning of the 4th century, first quotes the text, "From my will I will praise you," by which it signifies it is necessary to pray not unwillingly, but from a good understanding and a joyful mind. We speak to make this clear, since the word presents, in the order of an example, those who are accustomed to use a cathara and psalterion, two of the instruments mentioned there in the text of the Old Testament. The Spirit does not enjoin you to play a melody by strings, nor commands those with a care for rectitude of mind to touch worldly pastimes, but he commands you to make doxologies with the joy that befits holiness. Probably because the psalmist follows the old customs. See, he's a Jew writing in the Old Testament. He has mentioned here the instruments, for it was the custom of the Jews to strike the lyre and to employ cymbals and other such things when they sang praise in their temple. Notice how he does not command the saints, the upright, to sacrifice oxen or to use smoke and incense, but rather to speak praise and to offer bloodless sacrifice, which is the symbol of the Christian manner of life. It's very common to put instrumental music in the context of animal sacrifices, as Cyril is doing here, for forbidding bloody sacrifices, and he quotes another passage from the Psalms. Forbidding those things, he exhorts to odes and melodies, saying, "Sacrifice to the Lord, a sacrifice of praise." The contrast is always between the animal sacrifices of the Old Testament and the spiritual sacrifice of odes and melodies of song, as he expresses it here. Another man from Alexandria, Didymus the blind, he's called, commenting on the same passage, the confession here is clearly giving thanks. One is to do this with kaphara. If the kaphara may be the body, the extended strings would be none other than the senses which we employ in praising the Lord rhythmically and harmoniously. Cyril takes that history of salvation approach. The Jews did it one way, we do it a different way now. Didymus takes this allegorical approach, that instead of the literal instrument, you use the body. And if one takes the kaphara as the soul, its faculties, such as memory, assent, and others in accordance with reason, shall confess the Lord mystically and be played by the mind like the strings. Well, he goes on to somewhat more fanciful allegory. I'll leave that aside. Theodoret, on the same passage, all these things were performed in the worship under the law, for they played kitharas, cymbals, and timpanis, and other musical instruments. The things spoken apply also to us when understood spiritually, and we are able to express a pleasant sound and be ourselves a harmonious instrument and to praise God through all our sensible and intellectual faculties. Well, I could go on, but I'm sure that's enough, and so we'll let you out a few minutes early. Some of you may have some questions, and we'll stay around to try to talk to you if you care to do that. Thank you for your presence and your attention this morning, and we'll conclude the series tomorrow morning. Hi, Greg. I've seen you a couple of times.
Yes.
And got to talk to you.
Can I ask you a question related to this?
Very good. Very good time. Didn't know you've been learning modern Greek.
I have lots of modern Greeks up my way. Yeah, I get a lot of chances to practice.
We have a Greek student here at ACC.
Yes, I want to greet him. I want is it Dinos? I have my own kind of Greek type that I import from Matt. I need to get in touch with him. I need to do just with the circumflex and the school of breathing.
Irvin Bishop here might be able to help you to get the all lectures. He's giving paper.
Hi, Chef.
You kept up when you were a star point A student or Chinese student. Excuse me. Y'all have it? Oh, I see. There is a little bit of this, not very common, but I'll just go up there and see if I can do it. Sure will. In church, apparently it's not something that we normally but occasionally I would have synagogue, they do mention that there was some opposition here. Choirs in the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox Church today, the choirs are all male.
I don't think one secondary.
But there are some passages on that. I'm not sure if you can find it right now. It's not commented on very often, but it is earlier passages say the
Well, I got to do that. They did years ago, and I had a blast.
yes, surely did.
We'll see you.
I really hadn't thought about it. I'll try to remember to do that. Yeah, okay.
I have a question. Maybe about 15 would be even better. Pardon me for not being able to draw it from what you said today. But if we assume that much of the early church pattern of worship pattern after the synagogue. He did not use the instrument, and there was a natural early aversion to the instrument. Why can we not say that it was all a matter of custom and the situation of the day, and therefore with a different attitude toward the instrument now?
That's what I'll be dealing with tomorrow. It does, I guess, get to be a judgmental matter, but I try to present what I think are, a kind of theology of worship with which singing is more consistent than instrumental music. It's not the sort of thing that you can, write it off, but maybe it's decisively and emphatically as some of our brethren. But it's kind of persuasive to me that this kind of music fits what's the nature of worship, and this other does not. It's more appropriate. I may not cover it fully, but that does touch on, that's why I think, doctrinal consideration has to come in, just the history by itself. Although it's a potent argument, it doesn't necessarily settle it. No, because two people are coming over my office for country private, so I'll just have to miss voting rights. Yes. How are you? Thank you for the review. Appreciate it. Next chapter. Are you going to be somewhere for a while? I'd lost touch with you. I didn't realize that you were up there.
Well, sometimes we move around pretty fast. But I don't know. I'm trying to find a situation or another church. I have one question here during the search. Are you aware of any term?
For watching this video. If you like this content and if you want to see more of it, please leave a like on the video and be sure to leave a comment underneath telling us what you thought about the video. And please subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Alright, I hope everyone has a great day.